Welcome to Silicon Valley Buzz, a TV show that discusses happenings about this, the most fertile spot on the planet for new ideas. I'm your host, Seth Shostak. And tonight, rent control. In this overheated housing market that is Mountain View these days, do we need to put on the brakes? Do we need to rein it in a little bit to ensure that people can stay in their homes? Well, maybe that will have unforeseen, maybe unpleasant consequences. This will be on the ballot in November. There will be two measures dealing with rent control. So I'm particularly pleased, if you didn't get that, particularly pleased to have two folks here to discuss this issue with me tonight. And to begin with, we have Joshua Howard. Joshua is the Senior Vice President of the California Apartment Association. Did I get that right, Joshua?
Yes, you did.
Approximately right, anyhow. And next to Joshua is Daniel DeBolt, Communications Coordinator for Yes on V, and a third-generation Mountain View resident. Thanks very much for being here, Daniel. I'm going to start with you, by the way. Let me ask you, what is the incentive here? Why do we need to have the city tell landlords how much rent they can charge?
So the city of Mountain View has been suffering from a worsening housing shortage for decades. Every time that there's an economic boom, people are displaced from Mountain View. It happens very quietly and casually. It's business as usual, and it's gotten so bad in the last 7 years. Rents went up 80% in Mountain View, which is an astonishing number. And I spent 9 years as a reporter for the Mountain View Voice covering City Hall, and I realized how difficult it really is to fix this housing shortage because there is such extreme job growth in Mountain View and Silicon Valley. And I realized that the people really need to be protected from what is essentially price gouging on rents. These rent increases are unnecessary and very extreme.
Well, let me ask you. You said 80% in the last 7 years. That sounds like a doubling time of, I don't know, less than 10 years, right?
Yeah, almost doubling, yeah.
And is there any precedent for that? Has that ever happened before in Mountain View?
Not to my knowledge, no. It's very...
And what's driving that? I mean, is it Google? Is it the high-tech industry? Is it, you say it's gouging, but maybe that's just the market.
Yeah, it is the market, and I mean the market is it's the job growth. It's Google's job growth. There's been a lot of job growth, and there's no place for people to live. So landlords apartment owners are able to charge very high rents, and they have an incentive to charge rent increases that people cannot afford. They have an incentive to evict people who cannot pay the rent, and it causes profound stress on our community, which is very unnecessary. Because there are good apartment owners who do not have to do this, so it's very clear to the people behind Measure V that these rent increases are just not necessary.
Okay, well, we're going to get back to the measures a little bit later. Joshua, it's a seller's market, right? Do you think we need to rein in the uptick in rents?
You know, Seth, I think we first need to understand why we're having this conversation. We're having this conversation because we've had unprecedented job growth over the past 8 years. We've come out of the Great Recession in a very strong recovery. Unfortunately, as Google, Facebook, and so many other employers have hired thousands of employees, we have not built enough housing to meet the demand for this influx of jobs. And it's unfortunate that we do not have the housing that we need to accommodate the growing workforce, to accommodate growing families and folks who want to stay in the community. Quite frankly, it's an issue of supply and demand, but it goes further than that. Past couple of years, we've seen the loss of redevelopment agencies. Redevelopment agencies were funding mechanisms that provided funding for affordable housing. When that went away at the state level, that took billions of dollars for low-income housing out of California, and it went away. We also have local governments that have not been building and permitting enough housing. In fact, in Santa Clara County alone, we've built permitted, I should say, less than 60% of the housing that we need. And when you have those factors come into play, it drives the price of housing up. no one disputes we have a housing crisis, but rent control is not the solution to address that crisis. It will not build one unit of housing, and it will not bring any prices down for anyone.
Well, when I drive down El Camino Real these days in Mountain View and surrounding communities, I am astounded by the amount of construction, and most of it looks like housing to me. Is that not the case? I mean, it looks like an awful lot of housing, and in fact, it makes me wonder what happened to the resolutions that were made by city council candidates years and years ago to say, look, we figure 60,000 people is the right number for Mountain View's population into the future. That's clearly been exceeded already, and when I look at all that housing, I think it's going to be really exceeded in the future. What's going to happen?
Well, Mountain View now is a population of almost 75,000 people, and we're finally seeing the effects of new construction. And the City Council over the past 8 years has been very progressive in trying to get more housing built along transit corridors, hence why you see the dense development along the El Camino. We're finally starting to see the benefits of that housing. Today in the Mercury News, there was a report that rents for the first time in years in Silicon Valley have actually started to flatten out and in some cases go down. That's a testament to the fact that we've got more housing coming online and there are now more choices for consumers.
All right, let's consider the two measures that will be on the November 8 ballot, because that's what listeners are going to have, viewers are going to have to consider. There's Measure V for victory and Measure W for win. And while both would impose some sort of braking mechanism on increasing rents, they're not the same. They're quite different. Let's start with Measure V. That's your expertise, Daniel. Tell me what it does.
So it does two basic things. It limits rent increases to the rate of inflation. It guarantees a fair rate of return for landlords when they need to do maintenance, for example, and the cost makes it hard for them to get a fair rate of return on their investment. They can petition for a rent increase to pay for that. And so that's the main thing it does, is it limits rent increases in a very reasonable way. The other main thing it does is it prevents evictions for no cause. Especially the evictions that are done just to raise the rent. Under state law in a rent-controlled city, a landlord is allowed to raise the rent when somebody moves out to market rent, to market rates. They can double the rent if they want. They can raise it however high they want. So there needs to be a protection against opportunistic evictions. So that's what just cause does. It requires a reason.
That sounds like a hard thing to prove. Is that a hard thing to prove?
Well, no, it's usually, I mean, they just have to give a reason, essentially, when they evict somebody. So they have to either not pay the rent, break the lease, do something illegal, cause problems for other tenants. Then they have to give that reason when they're evicted.
Now, doesn't Measure V change the charter of the city?
It does do that, and we did that very intentionally because if we had done it as an ordinance, it would have been open to attack. In other cities, landlord organizations have put charter amendments on the ballot to make rent control ordinances illegal. The other thing that a charter amendment does is it makes this so that if you're a renter, your standard of living is not going to be constantly under attack from every time that there's a city council election and landlord organizations are able to spend $90,000 on their candidates to overturn the rent control, which is, 2 years ago, Joshua's organization spent $90,000 to influence the city council election, and it's probably going to continue to happen. So, as a renter, I don't want my standard of living to be constantly under attack. So it makes a lot of sense to me to make this a charter amendment so that it can only be changed when voters want it to be changed.
Well, I mean, sorry.
I have to respectfully disagree with Daniel. Measure V is far more than a rent control program. Measure V does several things. Number one, it forces landlords to subsidize the rents of their tenants and forces property owners, regardless of the tenant's income, to subsidize what their rent is. And there is no means testing provision in Measure V, so anyone, whether they are making $150,000 a year or $35,000 a year, are going to benefit from those subsidies from the property owner. Now, the legislative analyst in Sacramento has opined that one of the detrimental effects of rent control is it discourages individuals of higher income from moving out of the unit that they may have outgrown simply because they are getting the benefits of lower rent. So in effect, rent control is not going to help the very people who need the help the most, because these units can be taken up by individuals of higher income, and there's no income criteria to qualify for the benefits of rent control. What's also important to note is Measure V sets up a very large, cumbersome bureaucracy. Measure V creates a rental housing commission of members who are appointed by the City Council, but there are no provisions in the charter amendment for the qualifications for the rent commissioners, no provisions for how they're to conduct their meetings or their operations, and it makes the rental housing commission the judge, jury, and executioner over landlord-tenant disputes. The Rental Housing Commission has carte blanche authority to set its own budget, set fees on property owners, and take funding from other city departments to fund its own operations. And it's unaccountable to the City Council, unaccountable to the city manager, and by having it as a charter amendment, you cannot address unintended consequences without going back to the voters. And every time a change has to be made, it's going to cost several $100,000 just for the city to put this on the ballot.
Okay, this is an objection that's been made by some of the City Council members themselves,
yeah.
right? So how would you
let me respond to these talking points. So basically, the idea that this is going to threaten the city budget is not based on any fact. Basically, the Measure V does allow, it empowers the Rental Housing Committee to request and receive funds. It does not entitle them to anything in the city budget. There's no reason to think that we're going to have to choose between rent control and firefighters. That's not going to happen. The Rental Housing Committee does get to set its own budget, and balancing that budget is as simple as adjusting the fee that funds rent control, which is a fee on apartments, which can be split between landlords and tenants. So it's a very simple process that's worked well in 12 California cities that have rent control. Rent control is as time-tested as a policy can be. The reason why 69% of voters in Mountain View support rent control, according to our polling, and I think according to Apartment Association's own polling, is because it is as proven as a policy can be. People realize voters in California have supported rent control. They fought off an attack against rent control in 2009 with Proposition 98, and that was even during a primary election where a few people voted. The things that Joshua is saying about these are recycled talking points against rent control that have been disproven over and over.
Well, what about the first point he made here, that it results in a subsidy of sometimes renters who really don't need any subsidy simply because you've artificially held these?
He's got it backwards. Renters are subsidizing landlords. We're the ones who pay the landlords. They do not pay us.
Well, when the market rent continues to go up, and a property owner can't make a fair return on their investment, and they have to go to the Rental Housing Commission and hope that 5 commissioners will know how to read financial statements, know how to understand economics, and know how to, in effect, determine the outcome of one's investment, and they say no, in effect, they're forcing that subsidy onto the property owner to give that subsidy to the resident. I also take exception to Mr. DeBolt's characterization on just cause eviction. It's not as simple as stating a reason and the individual moves out. Under just cause for eviction, a property owner has to prove cause for terminating a tenancy. And what's scary about Measure V is Measure V has language in there that states that even if someone commits criminal activity on the property, they cannot be evicted until they're given a warning and asked to correct their behavior. And if they commit that same crime on the property, then the property owner can commence the eviction proceeding. Meanwhile, putting families at risk of criminal activity that's taking place on the property, and quite honestly forcing families to leave Mountain View or leave that community because they're afraid of the neighbor next door who's committing crime, and the property owner and the police cannot get them out.
What about the...
Can I respond to that? I mean, this is a landlord talking point that comes up time and time again, and it is a horror story. It is a horror story that does not show up in reality. And if you go into a court where they deal with these evictions, they happen on a daily basis. They're business as usual. When people can be evicted in rent-controlled cities without a whole lot of fuss. It's just not true.
All right, well, let me ask something else. You say that there's been plenty of precedent for the kind of rent control that Measure V is. And I want to get to Measure W so we don't leave it out in the cold. But what about our neighboring communities? You know, Sunnyvale to the south, Palo Alto to the north. Do either of those have any sort of rent control?
No, they do not.
Okay, and so 5 years down the road, if we passed, for example, Measure V, what do you see as the relative position of Mountain View in terms of attracting, new residents vis-a-vis these other surrounding communities?
I think it's going to continue to be an incredibly desirable place because we will have protected the diversity of the city. We will have protected the people who make the city great, the teachers, the experienced teachers who are being forced out. Over 100 teachers left the local elementary school district since last year because of presumably because of skyrocketing rents. The school district blames skyrocketing rents. They're actually asking people to provide spare bedrooms for teachers so that they can recruit teachers.
Measure V would limit rate increases to 5% per year, right?
No, it's inflation, which is typically 2 to 3%. It can go up to 5%.
It can go up to 5%, but I mean that's the absolute cap. It's like an adjustable rate mortgage in a sense. It follows an index, right? The consumer price index.
It's
here
not
locally.
quite as bad as an issue. It's not that unstable. It's not
that unstable.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think what's important to recognize, what I think the Tenants Coalition did not take into account, is the City Council has not been resting on their laurels when it comes to addressing housing issues and comes to addressing the issues of property owners and renters. Over the past year, the City Council has strengthened their tenant relocation ordinance. They've expanded the amount of assistance that property owners must give to a tenant who's being asked to move so a property owner can renovate or rehabilitate a building. The City Council has adopted a right to a lease program where every property owner in Mountain View is required to offer every resident a lease of at least 6 or 12 months. That provides the resident with stability from being evicted without cause and stability from their rent not increasing for the duration of that lease agreement. Those both just went into effect within the past year and a half, and the City Council just in March adopted a mediation and arbitration program to provide dispute resolution for tenants who receive a rent increase in excess of 7.2%. We haven't even given these programs a chance to work, but it's clear that the Tenants Coalition has one objective in mind, and that's rent control. And they've not allowed anything that the council has done to work, not allowed any of these other policies to go into effect. And I should say the City Council has also put aside several $100,000 to provide short-term cash rental assistance to Mountain View residents who receive a rent increase or find themselves they're unable to afford to stay in Mountain View. Through the council's affordable housing funding, they've partnered with the Community Services Agency and are providing short-term rental grants to keep people in their homes who fear they may have to leave because of the cost of living.
Okay. I'm going to interrupt this volley because I can see this volley could go on for a long time. I want to get to Measure W, and I'm going to ask you, Joshua, Measure W, it comes from it doesn't come from the Tenants Association, right? It comes from the other side in a way. Tell me about Measure W. What would it do?
Measure W was put on the ballot by the City Council. The City Council was clear that they were concerned about the unintended consequences of Measure V and didn't like the idea that Measure V locked rent control into the city charter and was so inflexible. Measure W is still a rent control ordinance. Measure W limits rent increases to 5% and provides a dispute resolution process for rent increases over 5%.
Okay, so if I'm a renter here, right, and Measure W is in force, right, and my landlord sends me a letter and says, by the way, beginning next month your rent goes up, 15%. What recourse do I have with Measure W?
So if I was a renter under Measure W, I would be very scared. And the reason why is because under Measure W, a landlord can kick me out for any reason at all as long as they pay some minimal relocation expenses. So I don't know if you can even call Measure W rent control because a landlord can get around any kind of required limit on rent increases.
Tenant control.
I don't know what you would call it. It's not even real rent control in my mind. And it was created by rent control opponents on the City Council on advice from Joshua's organization. And as far as I know, Joshua's organization is unequivocally opposed to rent control, so I really wonder about that.
We are unequivocally opposed to measures V and W. Both measures do not address the housing crisis facing Mountain View.
What if one of them passes? Which one would you prefer?
They will both fail on Election Day, and they both should fail on Election Day because they will not address the housing challenges facing Mountain View. They will not bring rents down for anyone who's concerned about rising rents in Mountain View. They will not make housing more affordable. And in fact, measures V and W should rather be termed, you had a term for it, I'd call them vindictive and wrong.
Are they both going to fail?
I don't think so. If Measure V fails, you can blame the opponents on the City Council who put Measure W on the ballot to try to confuse voters and split the vote just enough so that there won't be enough people voting for V. And the fact is that in the last 6 years in Silicon Valley, we've created 166,000 jobs and only 25,000 homes.
And let's
think
focus
about
on
that.
You both agree on that.
Let's focus on creating the housing we need.
But the thing is, the City Council is doing a lot. They're building 2,500 homes now. They're studying 15,000. But when you consider the regional problem, that is just a drop in the bucket. And I do not see a huge regional movement to really change and hold city councils accountable and hold companies like Google accountable to actually provide housing for those jobs. It's just not happening. We need to protect renters in the meantime. We need to protect hardworking families. We need to protect experienced employees who are being forced out. So we have a lot of local businesses who are supporting Measure V because they cannot hang on to experienced employees. Our society is paying a huge cost for these extreme rent increases that are totally unnecessary.
I had an uncle in New York City, and he was complaining to me as a kid, I was the kid, about rent control in New York. And he said the problem was they didn't improve the housing, they didn't maintain the housing. He thought that overall it had a bad effect.
And that happens even today. That happens today. There's 70% of Mountain View apartments have some kind of code violation or another, according to the city.
So this isn't going to affect
the reason why is because tenants are scared to report health and safety code violations because they can be evicted.
No, they can't.
They can be evicted for any reason at all. They can have extreme rent increases done in retaliation because they've reported mold, they've reported termites, cockroaches, all these things that can happen no matter what.
I would just close on this point with this. Under state law, rental property owners cannot evict someone because they raised a code enforcement issue. They cannot go ahead and terminate a tenancy because the tenant came forward with a mold complaint or a habitability issue. That's illegal under state law, and there's clear recourse for that to happen.
It doesn't keep tenants from being terrified of it.
And the tenants should know their rights, they should know their responsibilities, and that's part of why the city put in place a dispute resolution program that doesn't just deal with rent increases. It deals with disputes over security deposits.
There's absolutely no teeth to this program.
Disputes over terminations, and we need to give those programs a chance to work. In addition, Mountain View has a robust code enforcement program where there's inspectors that go to every rental unit on a rotating basis to ensure that those units are compliant with building and safety codes.
All right, let me just ask the two of you individually now. Give me the apocalyptic scenario. I think in your case, Daniel, that would be if neither measure passes, or maybe if only W passed, but you're obviously in favor of V, but suppose neither measure passed. What does that do to the city a few years down the road?
So Measure W is very unlikely to pass. Nobody's seriously campaigning for it. Thousands of residents are not behind it. Thousands of residents are behind Measure V.
It was a citizen initiative,
yeah,
right?
7,311 people signed the petition to put it on the ballot. Over 100 volunteers helped get those signatures because it's something that a lot of people believe in for good reason. If it doesn't pass, we're going to continue to see the loss of experienced teachers, experienced employees. Our hardworking families are going to be under more stress. If the housing crisis gets, if it cools off, it's just going to get worse again the next time that there's an economic boom. They come and go all the time in Silicon Valley. I've lived through many of them. My own family was displaced through the 80s and 90s. I grew up without my cousins and my uncles, around because they had to move places that are more affordable for the working class. And that's just going to continue to be how Mountain View is. It's going to continue to be business as usual, and that's just not okay.
How about you? What if they both pass, or one of them passes?
If Measure V passes, it would be a very sad day for Mountain View. Number one, it sets up, as I mentioned, an unaccountable bureaucracy that can cost the city millions of dollars and force cuts to other city departments and put the general fund and Mountain View City Services at risk. Those are the quality services that residents in Mountain View depend on. Second is, if you look carefully at the language of Measure V, it also says that property owners can only recover the costs of improvements to maintain the current state of the building. They cannot recover the cost to make major improvements or renovations to enhance a property. So we will see the deterioration of rental property in Mountain View, and we'll start to see that rent control, just like it has in other cities, every other city that has adopted rent control, we've seen high prices, we've seen individuals who need housing get priced out because those who are fortunate enough to get rent control stay in their unit, and we will not see the problem solved. In addition, we'll likely see developers who are finding Mountain View to be an attractive place to provide housing shy away because of the uncertainty that Measure V puts over the housing market, knowing that there could be other regulations that could soon follow.
There's absolutely nothing in Measure V that prevents the housing development that we need. New housing is exempt. The other point that Joshua Howard made about the buildings deteriorating, I don't think that does not play out in other cities with similar laws, and the reason why is because under state law, landlords can raise rents as high as they want when somebody moves out. That provides an incentive to rehabilitate that unit, and then people who stay in their units for a long time appreciate the fact that they do not have extreme rent increases, and people aren't going to demand that their units be fancy.
Unfortunately, I have to cut this off because we're under KMVT program control here, and we're out of time. November 8th, it's up to you. You've heard some of the arguments here tonight, and I urge you to read the local papers to hear more of them. I want to thank my guests, both of them, for being very, very informative. Also, thanks to our expert KMVT crew and producer Bobby Chastain. I'm Seth Shostak, inviting you to join us next time for Silicon Valley Buzz.